Okay, so we're going to talk about tables a little bit. This gets a little bit more confusing, but if you will think of them as just simple grids, and there are grids that you can put inside of each other. So if you have a large table, you can put grids inside of one cell of that table. And so it makes it where you can divide things up and use alignment. It makes it fairly simple. The coding gets a little more complicated, but everything we do from here on out, the coding is going to get more complicated. So that's just something we're going to have to work with. One of the things you may want to do is actually use the insert menu. So there's a lot of things on it that makes life a little bit easier rather than having to go through all the commands. To do that, you just go under Window and then Insert. It should pop up over on this side. If you drag it up here, then it will pop in there and you can drag this out from that. Everything that's in here, you can go up here and go through the codes to do this, or go through the text commands and do the same thing. There are several ways to make tables. I'm going to show you this most straightforward, and then we'll go on to some other ones later once you kind of get a little more familiar with this. This fifth icon over that kind of looks like a waffle iron is table. So if you click on that, you get this dialog box. If you've ever worked with tables in something like Microsoft Word, they function in HTML similarly. So if you don't have to really worry about the number of rows as much as the number of columns. You need to figure out how many columns you want before you start, and it will make your life easier. Rows, all you have to do is go to the last cell, hit tab, and it adds another row. So that becomes less of an issue. There are two different kinds of tables, or two different measures for the overall size of the table. You can do it where it's variable or fluid, and a lot of times we'll talk about fluid measurements later. That becomes important to understand the distinction. But you can have fixed sizes and you can have fluid sizes. This particular one is set up as a fixed size of 200 pixels. I can set it up so that it's fluid, so it's a percentage. So I'm going to change that and make it 80%. I don't want a border on this, so I'm going to go ahead and put it to 0. If you take it out, usually it will work, but some browsers have default. Anytime you don't tell it specifically what it is, it being the browser, then sometimes it will guess at what it thinks. It will use its default to get the code in. Sometimes its default is not what you want. So I have a tendency to go ahead and tell it exactly what I want on everything rather than assume that the default's going to be what I'm wanting. So I'm going to go ahead and set that to 0. Padding and spacing is around the cells. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but it's actually usually easier to add another column or row to get your padding and spacing exactly the way you want it rather than using padding and spacing. But that's something we'll look at. The headers and captions we're not going to mess with for right now. So we have a table. It has 3 rows, 3 columns. It's going to be 80% of the screen. However big that screen is, it's going to come in from the edges. So that's an important distinction. Refresh. So here's my table. It's exactly what it, as described, I guess you'd say. You can do some editing now, though. One thing you can do is you can center this. So for those of you that were struggling to make it look the way you wanted to in the middle of the page, that's the easiest thing to do. Just come down to Properties when you're on it and change the alignment to center. You can have some CSS applied overall. We're not going to really be doing that at this point. But we have this table. Okay, when you put content in your table, it will stretch to fit it. And also notice it collapsed. The default look is for it to be divided up equally between however many columns you have. But if you only put things in one column and there's no spaces like what I just did, then it is going to assume that you want it to go all the way across, and it's going to collapse the other cells. It will also, if you drag and well, let me just show you real quick. We'll just insert a table or an image real fast. Have this that's too large. If you put an image in a table and it's larger than the cell size, it will expand to fit the image. So You can't force it in. It will fill that up. Now, the way to get around that, if you want an image behind a cell and you don't want it to necessarily be, you want it to fit the cell and not worry about the image, is to put the image as a background in the cell, and then it will resize itself to whatever size that cell is. And we'll do that in just a minute. So we've got some of these things. What we want to do is start bringing that table back together so that we have these divided up. Now remember, this is in percentages, so you can, the interior doesn't necessarily have to stay in percentages also, but you can. So I'm going to take this first column and I'm going to change, with any luck, I'm going to change the width to 100 pixels and bring that in. So now this one's set at a fixed width, and you can see down here the little green numbers tell me what it is. The same thing on this one. Now I can leave these so that they're just defaults, or I can start working with them also. Once you start mixing fixed and fluid, it gets a little more confusing. So for your peace of mind, you're just going to have to work with this and see which ones come out the best for you. Notice they don't necessarily have heights, but sometimes you'll want to force a height. If you move to the left or right, or top or bottom of the table, you can select an entire row or column, and so that will make your life a little bit easier sometimes. So I can set the rows to be taller. Helps if you put it in the right spot. And so you can start sizing this so that it fits the way you want it to go in. One thing that I haven't showed you, it's not showing up on here. So now we have this table. Notice how it resized when it had more space. So this one's still 100 pixels wide. These are actually resized themselves to fit. If I want to change the color of a cell, all I have to do is click in it, come down here to where it says BG, and if you pause for a minute, it'll say background color, and then I can pick any of these other colors that I want until I get what I'm looking for. You can drag these larger. Sometimes it's a little inconsistent on how it codes it, so sometimes you miss it. It's a little bit of a hit and a miss on how it goes in. So that's how to put in just straight color. If you want to do a background image in a table, you need to go back to the code view, and so say that we want some kind of a background image on this particular one. So I'm going to go, you have a couple of different codes, tags, I mean, when you're working with tables. One of them, and the easiest to remember, is table. So that's everything. TD and TR are the other two tags that are inside to tell it whether it's rows or columns. The easiest way, TR is the table row. TD stands for table data, which is a cell. So there's not really anything for columns. The table, the TDs actually control the entire column. So everything moves as a unit. So if I want to take this cell up here and put something in the background, I'm going to come down to my table data. I'm going to go in to background and then browse for my image. And if it refreshes, you'll see the image up in the corner. Now, one thing to watch, it's still in a background image, so it still functions the same. So if I go back where it's wider, it's going to repeat. So if you want to use backgrounds and don't want them to repeat, you need to set that column to exactly the same size as your image. Now, the nice thing about putting them in the background, this is not going to be particularly legible, but I can still put text over the top of the image. Same thing with background color. I can put things in there. So there is some flexibility on how you create these when you're dealing with these background images. You can do the same thing with the entire table. Just go over to table, look at background, and then set the background for the table. So, and notice the table background is behind the cell information. So again, it's a cascade of how they're affecting each other, where they're bringing in the closest to the content are the TDs. So those are going to override the background color for the table. So something to keep in mind. And again, if this table were bigger, this image would repeat. So if I wanted to do something like this and make it so that that image does not repeat, then you want to make sure the table is a fixed size. You can go in and select your table. Now, 80%, the percentages is going to be a problem if you're using a background that you don't want to repeat. You would want to do a fixed size. So in this case, this image is 800 pixels, and so then it will pull it in to exactly that. If it gets bigger, it's going to again be problematic about how it does things. So that's the table, putting background images in your table. And the same thing, if you want to put a background image now on the page, it would be everything in the table is going to override the page. So if your page background is green or blue or gray or whatever, that's the way that's going to come in. Okay, a couple of other things. Notice by default it puts it in the middle of the page. You can change that by going down to your properties panel, and you have horizontal and vertical alignment. So I can tell it I want it centered, right, left. But vertically I can also tell it I want it on the top so that it doesn't float in the middle of the page. So you can do top, bottom, middle, all of those settings, and it affects. Now remember, this is not changing the background, this is just changing the content of that cell. Cells can have text or images, but if you make the image bigger, it's going to stretch. It doesn't matter whether it's fixed or relative, it will fit that image regardless. So you've got those. The one thing you want to watch, if you are, I think we talked about it a little bit last time, but if you're bringing in a cell color and you're not using the selector inside of Dreamweaver, one thing you want to make sure you do is start the code with a # or a hashtag. If you forget and leave that out, some browsers will interpret it correctly and some will just ignore it. So that's one of the things you want to watch. And in Dreamweaver, it will always show it because it guesses correctly. But if you put it in a lot of the browsers, it doesn't show up at all. So that's a really common mistake that you want to watch and avoid. We talked a little bit about background for the whole page last time, but just to review, if you go down here in the properties and click on page properties, go up under appearance HTML, then you have background image, background color, text. You can also set your defaults up here. So if you want everything on your page to be 10 pixel Arial, you can set that here, and then if you apply it to individual pieces of text, it'll override the default, but you're setting a default for the whole page here. Same thing with background color. I can apply a gray to it, and it doesn't affect what content I have inside of the table. One thing that we haven't really talked about is how to change those links so that they're not blue and underlined all the time. And what you want to do is go under links, and it is a CSS command, so it's going to put it into the style sheet on that page. You've got 4 different things that you can control. The link color, visited links, active links, and rollover links. I very seldom see anymore where the link color, visited links, and active links are anything other than the same thing. If you hit on an old page or one that people have tried to modify and haven't done this, what you'll see is the default is blue. When it gets to be a visited link, it's purple. Active link is a little bit weirder. It's the last one that was touched, and it's a different color yet. So I use the same color for all three of those, and then make the different one the rollover. So if that gives the user the feedback that yes, this is a link because it's going to act this way. So if I wanted to do that, I could set the link color as this, and then at this point I could just copy and paste it just to make sure that I get the code. I mean, with 6 digits you would think that you wouldn't miss it, but you might. So now what's going to happen is anywhere there's a link in this document, it's going to be this green color, but when I'm in a browser and I roll over it, it's going to change to this gray. You can also control the underline. You can turn it off. You can have it show only on rollover, or you can have it hide it on the rollover. So just for grins, we'll have it show it on the rollover. So we'll save this. I'm just going to link to an image so that we have something that is functional. Notice we got the green color. So if I roll over it, it goes to gray. So that's what I just did. And notice it's a little bit tough to see against the gray sky, but there is a slight underline underneath that. So that would be tables and setting them up. One other thing you can do, and I talked about it briefly and I need to show you, is you can put tables inside of tables. So for example, if I have all of this and then I want this subdivided further, rather than try to come in here and insert all kinds of weird things, the easiest way is just put in another table. And so this time I'll say 3, and say we want a really fine grid. We're going to set it 10. Now, usually when you start nesting them inside, you're going to want it to be a percentage, and you're going to want it to be 100%, because you're going to want it to take up that entire cell with another table. So now I have this little table inside, and I have the same controls over it that I did over the other one. If I come in and look at it, they will look exactly the same. It's just one is nested inside of the other. So, and this is where it actually, when I was talking about the cell padding and the spacing around them, what I tend to do is use another column or another row to get my spacing exactly the way that I want it. So if I only want it to be a few pixels wide, I can pull that over, and then when I do my content, I get that space, but then if I want to change it, I can just pull it apart more or change that setting. So you can use these to set up finer grids to help your alignment be exactly the way that you want it to be.